where do you put, as somebody who's fascinated by military history, where do you put violence as in terms of the human condition? Is it core to being human, or is it just a little tool that we use every once in a while?
So I'm going to respond to your question with a question. What do you see the difference being between violence and force? Let me go farther. I'm not sure that violence is something that we have to put up with as human beings forever, that we must resign ourselves to violence forever. But I have a much harder time seeing us able to abolish force. And there's going to be some ground where, if those two things are not the same, and I don't know that maybe they are, where there's certainly some crossover. And I think force, you're an engineer, you'll understand this better than I do, but think about it as a physical law. If you can't stop something from moving in a certain direction without pushing back in that same direction, I'm not sure that you can have a society or a civilization without the ability to use a counterforce when things are going wrong, whether it's on an individual level, right? A person attacks another person, so you step in to save that person, or on, even at the highest levels of politics or anything else, a counterforce to stop the inertia or the impetus of another movement. So I think that force is a simple, almost law of physics in human interaction, especially at the civilizational level. I think civilization requires a certain amount of, if not violence, then force. So, and again, they've talked. I mean, it goes back into Saint Augustine, all kinds of Christian beliefs about the proper use of force, and people have philosophically tried to decide between, can you have a sort of an ahimsa Buddhist sort of, we will be nonviolent toward everything and exert no force, or there's a reason to have force in order to create the space for good. I think force is inevitable. Now, we can talk, and I've not come up to the conclusion myself, if there is a distinction to be made between force and violence. I mean, is a non-violent force enough, or is violence, when done for the cause of good, a different thing than violence done either for the cause of evil, as you would say, or simply for random reasons? I mean, we humans lack control sometimes. We can be violent for no apparent reason or goal. And that's, I mean, listen, you look at the criminal justice system alone, and the way we interact with people who are acting out in ways that we as a society have decided is intolerable. Can you deal with that without force and at some level violence? I don't know. Can you maintain peacefulness without force? I don't know.
Just to be a little bit more specific about the idea of force, do you put force as general enough to include force in the space of ideas? So you mentioned Buddhism or religion or just Twitter.
I can think of no things farther apart than that.
Okay. Is the battles we do in the space of ideas, of the great debates throughout history, do you put force into that, or do you, in this conversation, are we trying to right now keep it to just physical force? In saying that you have an intuition that force might be with us much longer than violence.
I think the two bleed together. So because it's always my go-to example. I'm afraid, and I'm sure that the listeners all hate it, but take Germany during the 1920s, early 1930s, before the Nazis came to power. And they were always involved in some level of force, beating up in the streets or whatever it might be. But think about it more like an intellectual discussion until a certain point. It would be difficult, I imagine, to keep the intellectual counterforce of ideas from at some point degenerating into something that's more coercion, counterforce, if we want to use the phrases we were just talking about. So I think the two are intimately connected. I mean, actions follow thought, right? And at a certain point, I think especially when one is not achieving the goals that they want to achieve through peaceful discussion or argumentation, or trying to convince the other side, that sometimes the next level of operations is something a little bit more physically imposing, if that makes sense. We go from the intellectual to the physical.
Yeah, so it too easily spills over
Yes.
into violence.
Yes, and one leads to the other often.
So you kind of implied perhaps a hopeful message, but let me ask it in the form of a question. Do you think we'll always have war?
I think it goes to the force question too. So, for example, what do you do? I mean, let's play with nation states now. Although I don't know that nation states are something we should think of as a permanent
Oh,
construct forever.
interesting.
But how is one nation state supposed to prevent another nation state from acting in ways that it would see as either detrimental to the global community or detrimental to the interest of their own nation state? Um, and I think we've had this question going back to ancient times, but certainly in the 20th century, this has come up quite a bit. I mean, the whole Second World War argument sometimes revolves around the idea of what the proper counterforce should be. Can you create an entity, a League of Nations, a United Nations, a one world entity, maybe even that alleviates the need for counterforce involving mass violence and armies and navies and those things? I think that's an open discussion we're still having.